Hello, dear friends. Patrick here again. Part 9, Chapter 9, we're going to be covering today. And this chapter is called The Arc of the Continents, doing a review of Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth. And this chapter called The Arc of the Continents. Of course, it's a play on the Noah's Ark that he loves to use as a straw man argument. And, talking about how the continents were all together maybe at one time, called Pangaea, and then these different creatures, trying to explain why there's different creatures in different continents, and they're only endemic to those specific continents. And it's a lot of boring biobabble, but look what he does as he begins the chapter in basically the second paragraph. He says, having redefined the word island. So he redefines the word island into anything that just keeps a species separate from where it originally came from. Essentially, he's trying to make this long, convoluted theory for whatever reason. Having redefined the word island, the Sabbath, and he puts in parentheses here, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So he quotes Jesus, right? And he says, I can redefine words whenever I want. And he uses a quote from Jesus himself to justify making up his own definitions for words. Can you see how much that this individual is an embodiment of Satan himself? That he cannot even help himself. At every turn, he takes scripture and then he manipulates them for his own purposes. Whenever you see somebody manipulate scripture for their own purpose, be very, very, very careful, right? We're told that scripture is not a matter of man's interpretation, right? It is the words of Christ. He said they are spirit and they are life. It's like a spiritual food. If you start just using them for your own ends and to manipulate them, you're going to end up in a bad place, right? And we have to guard ourselves from doing that, because it's a temptation for any believer or unbeliever for that matter. But he does it here without any fear of God at all. He says, I redefine the word island. Why? Because the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Jesus said that, in essence, to say, a greater than the Sabbath is here. He said, don't judge by appearance, judge with righteous judgment. If you have to do a good deed on the Sabbath, aren't you going to do it? If you got to rescue something on the Sabbath, aren't you going to rescue your animal if it fell into a well, and so on and so forth? He was going to heal somebody on the Sabbath, and they were giving him a hard time. He went and did it anyway, right? And so Dawkins uses this reasoning to say, I don't have to follow any grammatical rules. I can make up words whenever I want. Jesus did it. I can do it. And so he goes on with his fantasy. Every species is a cousin of every other. Any two species are descended from an ancestral species which split in two. This is foundational to his theory of evolution, and it is just a theory, in spite of how adamant he is that it isn't, right? The evidence from modern animals gives us every reason to think that something like the story I've just told is what happened in the past. He tells this story, ridiculous story, right? Every one of the divergences between the ancestry of any animal and any other. So he's maintaining this silly fantasy that he has, and he just goes on and on about it. Differential natural selection. So he opens up a new term, differential natural selection, on page 256. And then after all this word salad, after all this biobabble, in the middle of page 256, what does he say? He begins a paragraph by saying, this is his words, once again, I must stress, the details of my little story are pure fiction. I'm not going to bore you to tears with the story that he told about new species, coming up from different land areas and whatnot. It could equally well have been the island population that gave rise to the mammals. The island could have been an oasis surrounded by desert. He uses this theory of isolated species as being a reason for the variety in species. So, good, okay. Have your fun. And of course, because it introduces him to Galapagos Islands, which were isolated, and which Darwin visited in the Beagle and wrote all about it, and so it allows him to dovetail into Darwin again. Aboriginal creations, which meant Darwin himself, look at this, page 260, Darwin himself, who had not yet fully embraced evolution, used the then current phrase Aboriginal creations, which meant that God had created them here and nowhere else. He used the same phrase of the giant tortoises, which then abounded on all the islands, and also of the 2 species of iguana. So Darwin had the sense to acknowledge God in certain circumstances. Dawkins doesn't have that. If he does, as we've seen in the previous chapter where he says, well, maybe God did make, the instructions for cells, he immediately backtracks right on very soon afterwards. Sometimes he's forced to because he paints himself into a corner. He says, well, maybe it was God that gave the initial instructions, but evolution, but natural selection, He's got a habit of doing that. But Darwin was much more acknowledging of God than Dawkins by a long shot. So he goes on and on about different trees. He talks about how trees might have just grew 10 feet high, but they grow 100 feet high, and why don't they just keep growing and growing? And he talks about the trade-off between growing higher to get more sunlight and, the you could call it the evolutionary cost of doing so. And if you're into that, that might be interesting to you. Here we go. Look at this gaslighting he does on page 268. How am I doing for time? Good. I'm going to finish this up quickly. It's almost too ridiculous to mention it, but I'm afraid I have to because of the more than 40% of the American population who, as I lamented in chapter 1, accept the Bible literally. Think what the geographical distribution of animals should look like if they'd all dispersed from Noah's Ark. Shouldn't there be some sort of law of decreasing species diversity as we move away from an epicenter, perhaps Mount Ararat? I don't need to tell you that this is not what we see. Why would all those marsupials, ranging from tiny pouched mice to koalas and bilbies to giant kangaroos and why would all these marsupials, but no Ithurians at all, have migrated en masse from Mount Ararat to Australia? Who's to say God didn't make different creatures in Australia because he felt like it? It's condescending gaslighting because, He says, once again, I'm sorry to take a sledgehammer to so small and fragile a net, but I have to, because more than 40% of the American people believe literally in this story of Noah's Ark. See, he's got this bugaboo that he repeats over again, that he despises Americans because they believe in the Bible, and he just can't handle that, right? He says we should be able to ignore them and get on with our science. But we can't afford to because they control school boards, they homeschool their children to deprive them of access to proper science teachers, and they include many members of the United States Congress, some state governors, and even presidential and vice presidential candidates. Oh, how terrible. This is so terrible that they believe in the Bible. What about how terrible it is that people in all those positions today, 15 years since this was written, are now atheists? All the more need for homeschooling children. He reveals here his political motivation. He wants to get atheism into the political sphere so that he can promote communism. Dawkins is a communist. There's no doubt about that. Just go ahead and look at the last tribute they did for Christopher Hitchens when they're calling each other comrades. People don't call each other comrades unless they're in a public meeting space, unless they're communists, right? And that's his goal. Atheism, embed atheism into the population, which will allow for communists, and then they'll create this communist utopia, which will, decimate the Earth's population because that's an enemy to the survival of the Earth in their mind. That's how the twisted mind of your typical overly educated atheist works, right? You see it right here on the top of page 270. It's obvious. Noah's Ark, it's a straw man argument that he takes advantage of to full effect. Could have been a localized flood. Could have been, just to fulfill the purpose while there was all kinds of creatures. I mean, when Noah was out and the waters were receding, he saw birds, right? The first thing he saw was a bird that came to get food, and then it didn't come back. And or was that from the ark itself? I got to reread the story of the ark. But there's no saying that there was not other creatures outside of the ark, even though he was instructed to take animals with him for a purpose. Maybe that was just to feed his family. Was it? I'm speculating here. He goes on and on and on about plate tectonics and all that stuff. But all I'm saying is that the story of Noah's Ark is not necessarily a metaphor, but the overarching story behind it is not necessarily, oh, this was all the animals in the earth went onto the ark that survived the flood. It never says that. It says that only Noah and the 8 people with him survived the flood, so that was the humans that survived. But as far as the animals, we don't know. There were obviously must have been tons of fish in the sea if he's floating around in an ark. He didn't have to take all those fish in the ark, did he? Of course not. You gotta use your head, right? But Dawkins uses the ark as a straw man to attack and say, oh, how is that possible if all the animals were in the ark? Silly. Silly, silly, silly. It's a silly story from start to finish. He always saying, oh, how could it be that these animals are here? Why not God put them there? Blue-footed boobies in the middle of nowhere. Why not? God's very creative. How am I doing for time? Okay, let me wrap this up. If there's any other notes on this chapter that I took while I read it, it's got some interesting parts. 274 is actually some reasonable, interesting information. And if you're interested in Age of the Earth or that kind of stuff, you might want to read. And he does reference a lot of other people, so there's some stuff you might want to cross-reference with some of the other people that he talks a lot about. Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, and he's says how great that is, a masterful treatment of the evidence from geological distribution. Yeah, okay, sure. And so there you go. I'm not going to go into much more detail on chapter 9 because I think I've talked enough about it, and it's just kind of giving me a headache. So let's leave chapter 9. We'll move on to chapter 10, part 10, in the next video. I really appreciate you watching. I hope if you have any questions on this chapter, you can leave them in the comments, or if there's something that jumps out at you that you'd like to share about the story of Noah's Ark, or something that I'm getting wrong. I'm not a scholar. I'm not one of these guys from Answers in Genesis. I'm not trying to research my own information about geology or the age of the earth or any of that stuff. I'm only using what Dawkins is giving me himself. So I'm listening to how he's arguing and how he's painting himself into a corner, how he contradicts himself, saying on the one hand, oh, maybe God is responsible for the complexity or the instruction, and on the other hand saying, oh no, it isn't. I'm looking at how often he uses biblical scripture and twists it around, or even hides it within his own writing. That is so devious, right? I want to make sure that if you're forced to read this book for whatever reason in a school or in a college course, or it's probably going to become mandatory reading in schools, especially in British schools where the country is going to shit in a handbag. That's the reason why, because they're taking out God. They're turning people into atheists so that they have no hope in a divine creator. They lose any faith they may have had. And then what happens? Their mind gets darkened, and then they're subject to any type of lies. When you don't have the Spirit of God and you don't have access to the truth, then you're cannon fodder for, look at the media, all the media that were gushing over this before the book even starts. What do they want to tell you? What do they want you to believe? And then you're just going to eat all that stuff up. So I'm only using his book. Like I said, if you have other ideas about, interesting discoveries about evidence for God in the world, which are happening more often, and I'm seeing videos about that here and there, feel free to share them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. So thank you for watching. God bless you. Have yourself a wonderful day. Don't forget to spend time with people you love. We'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.